a bubble the size of a grain of sand, trapped in tree sap that hardened while dinosaurs were still walking around. And when two geochemists finally cracked one open in a laboratory in the late 1980s, the air that came out was not the air we breathe, it was richer. Significantly richer, roughly 30% oxygen against the 21% in the room where they were standing. The paper ran in Science, one of the most conservative journals on Earth, and for a few years afterward the idea that the ancient sky was chemically different from ours moved from fringe speculation into the middle of a serious argument. Then the objections arrived, and the objections were good ones. But something strange happened to the story after that, and it has less to do with chemistry than with who has historically been allowed to own the substance that holds the evidence. Let's start with what amber actually is, because almost everyone gets this slightly wrong. Amber is not petrified wood. It is not a mineral in the ordinary sense. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It is fossilized resin, and resin is not sap. Sap is the sugary fluid that moves nutrients through a tree, the stuff that becomes maple syrup. Resin is something else entirely. Resin is a defensive secretion, a thick terpene-rich fluid that certain trees pump out when they are wounded, when insects bore into them, when fungus gets a foothold. It floods the injury, traps whatever is attacking, and hardens. It is antimicrobial. It is sticky, and in the right conditions, buried under sediment, cut off from oxygen, subjected to modest heat and pressure over millions of years, the volatile compounds evaporate away and the remaining polymer cross-links into a stable solid. That process takes an enormous amount of time. Resin that has only partially made the journey is called copal, and dealers have been selling copal as amber to tourists for about 400 years. Real amber from the Baltic runs roughly 40 million years old. Amber from the Dominican Republic runs 15 to 20 million. Amber from northern Myanmar, which is where this story gets genuinely dark, runs about 99 million years old, right in the middle of the Cretaceous. And the crucial thing, the thing that made two scientists at Harvard and the United States Geological Survey look at this material and see an instrument rather than a jewel, is that when resin flows over a surface it traps pockets of the surrounding atmosphere, little bubbles, thousands of them, in a single piece, sealed, in theory, by a polymer that has proven durable enough to survive 100 million years of burial. If that seal held, then every piece of amber on Earth is a sample bottle from a specific day in deep time. Robert Berner was a geochemist at Yale. Gary Landis was at the Geological Survey in Denver. In 1988, they published results from a quadrupole mass spectrometer setup where amber samples were crushed under vacuum and the released gas measured directly. Cretaceous amber came back at roughly 30% oxygen. Modern air and the copal controls came back around 21. The difference was not subtle. It was not a rounding error. It suggested an atmosphere with about half again as much oxygen in it as ours. Now, here is where a lot of channels would stop, because that is the exciting part. But the interesting part is what happened next. Within a year the rebuttals landed. Ben Hopfenberg and colleagues pointed out something obvious in hindsight, which is that polymers are permeable. Amber is a polymer. Gases diffuse through polymers at measurable rates, slowly, but 40 million years is not a short time. Thor Serling at Utah ran his own work and argued the bubbles had been exchanging with the outside world for the entire burial history, which would mean the reading was not a fossil atmosphere at all, but a smeared average contaminated by everything that had happened since. Others noted that crushing amber releases gas from the amber itself, not only from the bubbles, and that the polymer contains oxygen-bearing compounds that could inflate the number. Berner did not dig in. This is worth saying plainly, because the popular version of this story usually casts him as a suppressed truth-teller. He was not. He responded to the criticism by walking away from bubbles entirely and building something much harder to dismiss. He spent the next 20 years constructing a model called GeoCarbSulf, which reconstructs ancient atmospheric composition not from trapped gas, but from the carbon and sulfur isotope record preserved in marine sediments. The logic is a bookkeeping logic. Oxygen in the atmosphere is a balance between production, mostly photosynthesis, and the burial of organic carbon that would otherwise have rotted and consumed oxygen, and consumption, mostly weathering of rock and oxidation of sulfides. Every one of those processes leaves an isotopic fingerprint in the rock record. Track the fingerprints and you can back calculate the balance. The model produced a curve, and the curve says that atmospheric oxygen has not been stable. It says that around 300 million years ago, in the Carboniferous and early Permian, oxygen rose to something like 30%, possibly a little higher, before crashing to roughly 15% at the end of the Permian and then climbing back through the Mesozoic. So the number that came out of the bubble was wrong in method and roughly right in magnitude, just displaced in time. Berner got to the same neighborhood by the front door after the back door was closed on him. That is not suppression. That is how the process is supposed to work, and it almost never gets told this way. There are other lines of evidence, and they are independent of each other, which is what matters. The first is fire. Combustion requires oxygen, obviously, but the relationship is not linear. Below about 15%, plant material will not sustain a flame even when dry. Above about 35%, wet vegetation burns, and fire becomes so aggressive that laboratory work suggests forests could not persist. That gives you a hard ceiling and a hard floor. And the fossil record contains charcoal continuously from the late Devonian onward, which means oxygen has stayed inside that window for something like 400 million years. The abundance of charcoal in coal seams varies, and it varies in a way that lines up reasonably well with the model curve, peaking in exactly the interval the model says oxygen peaked. The second is bodies. In the Carboniferous, insects and arthropods reach sizes that are difficult to look at without a small feeling of vertigo. Meganeura, a griffinfly, had a wingspan around 70 centimeters. That is a predatory flying insect the size of a hawk. Arthropleura, a millipede relative, reached lengths over 2.5 meters. There were spiders and scorpions scaled up accordingly. And then, after the Permian, nothing at that scale ever appears again. Insects do not have lungs. They breathe through a passive network of tubes called tracheae that carry air directly to the tissues by diffusion. Diffusion has a hard geometric limit. Past a certain body thickness, the oxygen simply cannot reach the interior fast enough. Raise the concentration of oxygen in the outside air and you push that limit outward. John Harrison and colleagues at Arizona State have raised insects across multiple generations in oxygen-enriched chambers and gotten measurably larger animals, along with tracheal systems that reorganize in response. The mechanism is real, and it has been demonstrated in a laboratory. There are competing explanations. The absence of flying vertebrate predators before the late Jurassic probably mattered a great deal. Larval aquatic stages and oxygen levels in Carboniferous swamp water probably mattered too. Nobody serious claims oxygen was the only variable. But when three independent lines, isotope bookkeeping, charcoal frequency, and animal body size, all point at the same interval, the reasonable position is that the sky over the coal forests was not the sky over us. And that is where this stops being a story about geology and becomes a story about money. Because the Carboniferous is not an abstraction. The Carboniferous is the balance sheet of the modern world. That interval of extraordinary oxygen was produced by the burial of an almost incomprehensible volume of plant material in swamp basins across what is now Europe, Appalachia, and China. Oxygen went up precisely because carbon went down, locked into peat that never rotted. Those buried forests are coal. Every ton of it that came out of a Welsh valley or a West Virginia hollow or a Silesian shaft was a withdrawal from an account that took 60 million years to fill. Which means the Industrial Revolution was, in the most literal accounting sense available, the reversal of the process that made the ancient sky. We have spent 2 centuries taking the buried carbon back out and putting it in the air. The bookkeeping runs both directions. Hold that thought, because the material that started this whole argument has its own economic history, and it is considerably stranger than the coal one. Amber has been traded for at least 5,000 years. Baltic amber has been found in Mycenaean graves in Greece, in Egyptian tombs, in Bronze Age burials in Britain. The Amber Road, running from the southeastern Baltic coast down through Central Europe to the head of the Adriatic and on to Rome, is one of the oldest continuously documented trade routes in the world. Pliny the Elder records a Roman knight being dispatched north under Nero specifically to procure amber for gladiatorial games, and returning with so much of it that the nets protecting the spectators were studded with the stuff. Pliny also, with some irritation, notes the price. A small amber figurine cost more than a living, healthy slave. That single comparison tells you something about what this material meant. It is fossilized tree wound, and for most of recorded history it traded above human life. The reason is partly optical, partly medical, and partly electrical. Amber is warm to the touch in a way stone is not. It floats in salt water. It burns with a pleasant smell. And when you rub it, it picks up hair and dust. The Greek word for amber is electron. The entire vocabulary of electricity descends from a lump of fossil resin because William Gilbert, physician to Elizabeth I, used the amber effect as his reference case in 1600 when he coined the Latin term electricus. Baltic amber also contains between 3 and 8% succinic acid, which no other major amber deposit does in that quantity, and which underwrote a European folk pharmacology that ran for centuries. Teething necklaces made from Baltic amber are still sold today on exactly that claim, which the evidence does not support, but the market is real and it is old. Now, the ownership. Amber in the eastern Baltic washes up on the beaches of what is now the Kaliningrad coast and the Curonian Spit. It does not require mining. It requires walking along the shoreline after a storm and picking it up, which makes it, historically, one of the very few valuable commodities available to peasants without capital, without land, and without permission. That did not last. When the Teutonic Order took control of Prussia in the 13th century, they asserted what became known as the Bernstein Regal, the Amber Regal. A regalian right is a claim by the sovereign to a specific resource, regardless of who owns the land it sits on. The order claimed every piece of amber on the coast, not the land, the amber. Enforcement was not symbolic. Coastal villagers were required to swear oaths to surrender any amber they found. Amber wardens patrolled the beaches. Possession without authorization was a capital offence, and the record includes the name of Anselm von Lossenberg, an official remembered along that coast as the amber judge who hanged fishermen from the pine trees above the beach where they had picked it up. Whether every detail of that legend is accurate is genuinely disputed. The legal framework behind it is not. The gallows on the dunes exists in the folk memory of the entire Samland coast for a reason. Think about the mechanism for a second. A substance that lies free on a public shoreline is declared the exclusive property of the state. The people who physically collect it become criminals unless they hand it over. The state then sells it at a controlled price to a guild that has been granted the sole right to work it. In Bruges, in Lübeck, in Danzig, the amber paternoster makers held chartered monopolies on turning it into rosary beads, and the raw material reached them through a channel that no beachcomber could legally enter. That structure survived every change of regime. The order lost the territory. The Duchy of Prussia inherited the regal. The Kingdom of Prussia inherited it after that. The German Empire inherited it after that. The amber monopoly is one of the most durable pieces of property law in European history, and it outlived the institution that invented it by more than 600 years. In the 1850s, the extraction changed character entirely. Two entrepreneurs, Wilhelm Stantien and Moritz Becker, obtained concessions to dredge the Curonian lagoon. They started with the dredging spoil from harbour works and realised the deposits underneath were vastly richer than the beach yield. By the 1870s, Stantien and Becker had moved to open pit mining at Palmnicken on the Samland coast, cutting into the blue earth, the glauconitic marine layer that holds the amber, and they were producing on an industrial scale. The Prussian state watched this for a while, calculated, and in 1899 bought the entire operation and took it in-house. That mine is still running. It is at Yantani now, in the Kaliningrad Oblast, and it produces the substantial majority of the world's amber. The estimates vary, but they generally put the deposit at something like 90% of global reserves. A single pit, on a single stretch of coast, holding most of the accessible fossil resin on the planet, held continuously as a state monopoly from the 13th century. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Through the Teutonic Order, Prussia, Imperial Germany, the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation. Which brings us to the room. In 1701, Frederick I of Prussia commissioned a chamber-panelled floor-to-ceiling in amber mosaic, tonnes of it backed with gold leaf and mirrors. It took a decade, and it was, by any measure, one of the most expensive objects ever constructed. In 1716, Frederick William I gave it to Peter the Great of Russia as a diplomatic gift sweetening an alliance. It was shipped in crates to St. Petersburg, expanded, and eventually installed at the Catherine Palace outside the city. In 1941, German forces took Leningrad's outskirts, found the room, disassembled it in 36 hours, and shipped it to Königsberg, which is to say, they took it back to the coast it came from. It was displayed in the castle there. In 1945, the castle burned during the Soviet advance, and the amber room vanished. It has never been recovered. There is an entire minor industry of expeditions, salvage claims, and deathbed confessions surrounding it, and none of it has produced the room. Follow the object. Resin from a Baltic forest, 40 million years dead, claimed by a crusading order under threat of hanging, assembled into a chamber by a Prussian king, given to a Russian emperor to buy an alliance, stolen back by a German army, lost in a fire during a siege. The material never stops being a proxy for state power, from the first oath sworn by a fisherman to the last crate loaded in 1941. Now, here is where it becomes contemporary and uncomfortable. The amber that matters most scientifically today is not Baltic, it is Burmese. Burmite, from the Hukong Valley in Kachin State in northern Myanmar, is about 99 million years old, which places it in the Cenomanian, the Middle Cretaceous. It is the single richest window into terrestrial life in the age of dinosaurs that exists anywhere. Over 1,000 new species have been described from it. Feathers, a dinosaur tail with plumage intact, snakes, frogs, ancient flowers preserved down to the pollen. The Hukong Valley is also an active conflict zone. Control of the mining areas has moved between the Kachin Independence Army and the Myanmar military, and the trade has funded both. Extraction is done in hand-dug shafts with minimal safety provision, by workers who are frequently paid poorly and sometimes are not adults. The material moves overwhelmingly through Tengchong and other markets across the Chinese border, where it is bought by dealers and collectors, and specimens reach researchers through that commercial pipeline. In 2020, the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology sent a letter to its membership and to journal editors asking for a moratorium on publishing new research on Burmese amber acquired after the military escalation in Kachin State, on the grounds that academic demand was raising prices and therefore funding the conflict. The response fractured the field. Some journals adopted restrictions. Some researchers argued that refusing to study material already extracted simply destroyed knowledge without saving anyone, and that specimens would then disappear permanently into private collections. Around the same time, a specimen described as the smallest dinosaur ever found, Oculodentavis, was published in Nature and then retracted after other researchers argued the skull was a lizard. The provenance and the commercial pressure on the supply chain were part of the surrounding argument about how this material gets studied at all. So the situation, stated plainly, is this. The best physical archive of Cretaceous terrestrial life on Earth is being extracted by hand in a war zone and sold through an unregulated market, and the scientific community cannot agree on whether looking at it makes things better or worse. That is the same structure as the Bernstein Regal, inverted. In Prussia, the state seized the resource and criminalized the finders. In Kachin, armed groups tax the resource and the finders are on their own. Either way, the person who physically pulls the fossil out of the ground has the least claim on what happens to it, and the information locked inside it becomes a byproduct of an extraction economy that was never organized to produce information. and the information is the point. Because if you want to know what the sky was like 99 million years ago, the bubbles in Burmese amber are one of very few direct physical samples anyone has, not a model, not a proxy. Actual gas from actual air, if the seal held. So did it hold? The honest answer is probably not perfectly, and the field has moved on to better instruments. Modern work uses techniques that were not available to Berner and Landis, including laser ablation, high-resolution mass spectrometry, and careful screening of individual bubbles for evidence of fracturing or diffusion pathways. Some of that work has recovered oxygen values elevated above modern air. Some has not. Results vary by deposit, by preparation method, and by how aggressively the samples are screened. There is no consensus that amber bubbles give you a clean atmospheric reading, and anyone telling you there is a settled 30% number is overselling. But the underlying claim that the atmosphere has varied substantially over geological time is not fringe at all. It is textbook. The dispute is about magnitude and timing, not about whether it happened. And we know it happened because of a different kind of trapped bubble, one nobody argues about. Ice cores. Antarctic ice contains air bubbles sealed by compaction rather than polymerization, and the Vostok and Dome sea cores give a continuous atmospheric record back roughly 800,000 years. Those bubbles are how we know pre-industrial carbon dioxide sat around 280 parts per million and cycled between roughly 180 and 300 through the glacial rhythm. Nobody disputes the ice bubbles. The physics of the seal is better understood, and the timescale is short enough that diffusion is manageable. 800,000 years is a superb record. It is also nothing. It covers less than 1% of 1% of the time amber covers. Past that boundary, the direct sampling ends, and everything becomes inference from rock chemistry, and the confidence intervals widen enormously. So the shape of what we actually know is this. For the last 800,000 years, we have the air. For the 400 million years before that, we have a model, a charcoal record, and the sizes of dead insects. And one contested set of bubbles in fossil tree wounds that somebody tried to open in 1988 and got shouted down over. It is worth noting what else got extracted from trees along the way, because resin has an industrial history most people never hear about. Living pine resin was the basis of the naval stores trade, tar, pitch, turpentine and rosin, which kept wooden ships watertight and rope from rotting. Britain imported it from the Baltic for centuries, then encouraged production in the American colonies to escape that dependence. And the trade left its mark on North Carolina permanently, in a nickname that refers to what the work did to a man's feet. The same secretion that fossilizes into amber over 40 million years was, in its fresh form, a strategic material that navies fought over. Nations do not usually go to war over tree wounds. They did over this one, because a fleet without pitch is a fleet that sinks, and whoever controlled the pine forests controlled the range of every other fleet. And the record of that trade is still legible in customs ledgers, barrel counts and the port records, which is to say the paperwork of resin outlasted the forests that produced it. Now, the last piece, and it is the one that ties the geology to the ledger. Oxygen in the modern atmosphere is declining. This is measured, not modelled. Ralph Keeling, son of Charles Keeling, who established the carbon dioxide record at Mauna Loa, built an instrument sensitive enough to detect changes in the oxygen to nitrogen ratio and has been running the measurement since the late 1980s. Atmospheric oxygen is dropping at roughly 19 parts per million per year, which corresponds to a fall of about 4 molecules of oxygen for every 1,000 over the last few decades. That sounds alarming, and it is not, at least not for breathing. Oxygen is about 209,000 parts per million. The decline is a fraction of a percent, and it will not affect anyone's lungs on any human timescale. The reason Keeling built the instrument is not respiratory, it is accounting. Burning fossil carbon consumes oxygen in a known stoichiometric ratio, so measuring the oxygen loss tells you how much fossil fuel is actually being burned and, by subtraction, how much of the resulting carbon dioxide is being absorbed by the oceans versus the land. The oxygen measurement is an audit of the carbon books. And now compare the two gases as economic objects. Carbon dioxide has a price. Multiple prices, actually, across the European Union emissions trading system, the California and Quebec linked market, the Chinese national market, the voluntary offset market, and the various carbon taxes running in Scandinavia and Canada. There are futures contracts on it. There are financial instruments whose entire value derives from the right to emit it. An invisible gas has been successfully turned into a tradable asset class in the space of about 30 years. Oxygen has no price at all. There is an industrial gas market, obviously, where you can buy a cylinder, but the atmospheric commons has no oxygen instrument. Nobody holds a right to it. Nobody trades a claim on it. It is the one input to every animal on Earth that has never been enclosed, which is historically unusual because almost everything else has been. The Bernstein Regal enclosed fossil resin lying on a public beach. Enclosure Acts enclosed common grazing land across England. Mineral rights severed the ground from the ground beneath it. Water rights, spectrum licenses, fishing quotas, orbital slots. The pattern of the last 800 years is the steady conversion of things that belong to nobody into things that belong to somebody. Air is one of the last holdouts, and the carbon market is the first successful attempt to price a component of it. Notice what got priced, not the gas we need, the gas we produce as waste. The commons was enclosed on the disposal side rather than the supply side, because that is where the scarcity was legally constructible. Now hold both halves of this together. The ancient atmosphere, whatever its exact composition, was manufactured by the burial of organic carbon on a scale that has not recurred. That burial produced the coal seams. Those coal seams financed the Industrial Revolution, which produced the emissions, which produced the market that now prices the disposal of the emissions. The oxygen surplus of 300 million years ago and the carbon price of today are the same transaction, separated by an interval long enough that we stopped recognizing it as one. And the physical evidence of the original atmosphere sits inside a substance that has been under state monopoly, capital offense, wartime looting, and armed conflict for the entire period during which anyone was in a position to study it. That is the part worth sitting with. The bubble in the amber is not just a scientific object with a disputed seal. It is embedded in a material whose access has been controlled, without interruption, for 7 centuries. The Prussian state did not restrict amber because it wanted to suppress paleoclimatology. It restricted amber because amber was money. But the effect on the record is the same either way. The archive and the treasury were the same object, and the treasury always had first claim. There is a version of this story that says, "The ancient sky was hidden from you deliberately." That is not what the evidence supports. Berner published. His critics published. He revised his method and published again, and his model curve is in the textbooks. The system worked, slowly and argumentatively, which is how it works. But there is a quieter version that the evidence does support. It says that the physical remnants of a different atmosphere have been for most of history a luxury commodity, a state monopoly, a diplomatic gift, a war prize, and now a conflict mineral. It says the samples reach the laboratory last, after they have been through the market. It says that when we finally built instruments precise enough to interrogate the trapped air, the material holding it had already been through 600 years of being valued for its color instead of its contents. The forest that made the coal made the oxygen. The forest that made the amber sealed a sample of it. We burned the first one and put a price on the smoke. The second one is dug out of a valley in Kachin State by people who will never read the papers written about it. Somewhere in a crate in a private collection, or in a drawer in a museum, or still in the blue earth under the Samland coast, there is a piece of resin with a bubble in it that has not been opened. Inside that bubble is a sample of the air on a specific afternoon, on a specific hillside, before there were people, before there was ownership, before there was a legal category for a thing that belongs to nobody. We have never once been able to get at it without going through somebody's monopoly first. Make of that what you will.